April 16th of the expedition, we actually set aside a day to commemorate the work of Dr. Larry Harris in developing a corridor between Osceola National Forest and the Okefenokee National Forest through the Pinhook Swamp. Dr. Harris really focused during his professional years on a series of corridor projects in Florida, probably the most successful of which is the Pinhook Swamp. And so we had the event close to the Pinhook where we invited his family, some of his friends, some of his students out to talk about Dr. Harris's work. So we had students from the University of Florida and managers and administrators from the U.S. Forest Service come and present on the significance of Osceola National Forest and the Pinhook Swamp as an area for recreation, but also as an area for wildlife corridors and movement.
Larry inspired a lot of people. I'll mention some of the people that he inspired. Tom, Dave Mayer, the late Dave Mayer, who did pioneering research in Southwest Florida on the Florida panther, black bear, towards the end of his career. Reed Noss, he worked well, same ideas, colleagues internationally, people like George Schaller, Alan Rabinowitz, working on big cats and wildlife needing connectivity around the world. Dan Jansen in Costa Rica, they're all colleagues. I first became acquainted with Larry in the early '80s when we participated with a lot of local people actually here in this community. We had another champion who was sort of one of Larry's disciples. Was a lady who died in 2004, Judy Hancock. And Judy was about the hardest working volunteer conservationist I ever met. And she was real involved in work with Larry and promoting things like the connection between Osceola and the Okefenokee and many other things. I met him in the early '80s. We came here, provided input on the first set of National Forest and Florida management plans. I was coming out of North Carolina, and we were working on a number of southeastern forest plans. And Larry, we held a workshop in Gainesville, and Larry was one of our key presenters. And it was some of the key points. It's the same sort. A lot of it is the same stuff that was then as it was now. Plant longleaf on the historic longleaf sites. Get the burning right. Favor those key species like the black bear, the gopher tortoise, the red cockaded woodpecker. He was great on that.
I'm inspired by what I've heard of the past, and I'm inspired about the future from the folks in our expedition today. I never met Larry Harris, and I really wish I had. But I also never met a lot of people that got us to where we are today. The visionaries from the late 1800s who changed U.S. policy from a policy of disposing of lands for development to setting them aside in places like national forests and national parks.
My dad, Larry Harrison, was a professor, and he was at the University of Florida, came in, I think, 1972. And he was a biologist and a forester, and he really got interested back in the late 70s in this idea of biological diversity and corridors and conservation, landscape ecology. And that didn't really exist, as I understand, when he was going to school. And he had volunteered in the Peace Corps in Africa. And he came up with the idea over there. He saw the herds migrating, and he realized that with the fragmentation that was going on in Africa, that the herds were being cut off. And he thought this was a big deal. We came over here to the United States and realized we had the same type of problem. That with all the development, people were conserving lands, thank goodness in the 70s, the environmental movement, but there wasn't a lot of thought to linking them. And so in the early 80s, he wrote a book called The Fragmented Forest, where he came up with this sort of this concept of islands. and talked about how this was a great thing for conserving land, but it was not a great thing for natural populations, and it wasn't a great thing for biodiversity.
Well, I had the great joy and privilege of being a student of Dr. Larry Harris when I was at the University of Florida. And he and I maintained a good relationship after I got out in the workforce. And he and I actually got together and did some of the early planning on Pinhook Swamp. So I've been schooled in the theory of wildlife corridors and been able to participate in a small way in helping put some of that together over the years.
Dr. Tom Hochter, who's one of my dad's graduate students, he's a Harvard student, and he had actually come down to Florida and met my father, and he sort of changed his career path a little bit, went into biology, got his PhD, and as I understand it, he works very diligently with the landscape, the University of Florida, the College of Landscape Ecology, working on these ideas.
During a presentation by Tom Hochter from the Conservation Trust for Florida is when I kind of raised my hand and talked about the Florida Wildlife Corridor idea. You know, the Florida Wildlife Corridor idea has been around for a long time under lots of different names. Tom was presenting the Florida Ecological Greenways Network and taking us through the slides and through the images. It showed all the various connections and critical linkages throughout the state. If I was trying to summarize my contribution to all this, I just said, you know, why can't we string a few of these things together and call them Florida Wildlife Corridors?
In 1985, Larry recommended a set of corridor projects in different parts of the state that he thought were great examples of how, with just a little additional investment, we could protect really important functional ecological connectivity. People gravitated to that. And I think one of the reasons that people gravitated to that, I think there are two reasons. One is even though we have a lot of people who've moved to Florida from somewhere else, we might call them transplants, even those transplants recognize that there's something unique about Florida. And we've all gone to a really special state park, or we've experienced a rural landscape, even if it was just citrus groves. They've seen rural Florida. They saw them disappearing in various parts of the state. So they recognized that this idea of wildlife corridors was one way to maintain these large swaths of rural land that had these important values that Larry started talking about in the mid-1980s. But he also talked about things like clean water, clean air, water supply, etc. He was already talking about those ecosystem services at the same time. So as a follow-up, you know, there was a bit of a groundswell. You know, the mid-80s was also when we were starting with efforts to protect Florida through growth management laws. That's when a lot of the growth management legislation came to pass as well. So we were recognizing that rapid growth was having these negative consequences. It seemed to a lot of people wildlife corridors were an important part of that strategy.
The University of Florida Geoplan Center has done a lot of work working with the Department of Environmental Protection and a lot of stakeholders, scientists and so forth, to identify what are the most important corridors in the state of Florida. They've done some very impressive mapping. So there's a high level of understanding of where these particular areas are that are important. The Water Management District, among the various criteria that we use to figure out, well, where should we be acquiring property, one of the things we look to is that statewide map.
Our office is kind of an umbrella organization to help bring the pieces together, and we work closely with Dr. Tom Hochter with the University of Florida on the effort to identify the ecological greenways, and then within those greenways, the priorities, the critical linkages. This Florida Wildlife Corridor that the expedition crew has been on really ties together several of these critical linkages and puts the emphasis on how important it is to have that connection throughout the state, from north all the way through to the south.
Working with the Conservation Trust for Florida, also the Office of Greenways and Trails in the Florida Department of Environmental Protection, we developed a project that we call O2O, which stands for Ocala National Forest to Osceola National Forest and Okefenokee. If we protect the connections between them, we would have about 1 million acres of contiguous conservation lands in that particular corridor project.
We really have nothing but thanks for the many hundreds of people who have contributed over the last 3 decades to corridor thought and science and visioning in the state of Florida. so that 100 years from now we may be looking back and saying the Florida Wildlife Corridor effort got its start in 2012, but it really goes much further back in history than that. And so, we have a solid foundation here in Florida, unlike many other states, where people have been thinking about this for a long time and laying a foundation of science and political work to make something like this a possibility, where we have protected public lands and where we have protected private lands strung together in a network that connects the whole state of Florida.